Yes, I know, it's the wrong opera. But it's in the closing scene of the Valkyrie that we first hear in all its glory the complete theme for the hero Siegfried, who gives his name to this, the third opera of the Ring. Just for a change, let's start halfway through, during an interlude in the forest, where the youthful Siegfried lies on a grassy bank, looks up at the sun shining through the trees, and thinks about the mother he never knew. At this moment, the famous Forest Murmurs music breathes its way in. Isn't that the gentlest music you ever heard? And yet so many people think of Wagner as nothing but a heavy, thundering composer. Oh no, Wagner had a wonderful chamber music way with him, and he could do amazing things with the strings when he wanted to be sensuous and touching. A lot of people talk about Wagner as being nothing but bombast and heroics. It's chamber music, really.
It's soft, and it's soft for so long. I've now conducted 5 symphonic sections from the Ring with the symphony orchestra, which is a lot of fun because the orchestras love playing it, and you realize that if you don't have the singers, actually the music gains something, because you hear all this stuff in the orchestra which you don't hear because you always want to hush them and try to save the singers. But if you build 45 minutes of symphonic excerpts from the Ring, it will be almost equally very soft and hushed.
There's a lullaby part where Siegfried lies back and thinks of his mother who died giving him life. The music is of a rare beauty. But you know, the music that began that little excerpt is actually from Wotan's Farewell in the Valkyrie, so that this we heard in the fire music like this. But what Wagner does in Siegfried is to tack on the love theme to which Siegfried's parents first fell in love. You see how cunningly Wagner keeps tying the musical threads of his operas together. It makes us fall in love with the music straight away, and we don't realize it's because he's already played it to us. So Siegfried lies there and thinks about his mother. He may know nothing about her, but we do, because we're 2 operas ahead of him. We know she was called Sieglinde, and that she fled through the skies with the disobedient Brunhilde. Just before the god Wotan's furious punishment of Brunhilde meted out through the strength of his spear. And we know too that Brunhilde had her godhood stripped from her through a magic sleep. And that she became a prisoner on a rock surrounded by fire. To be awakened only by a fearless hero who will brave the flames. But there's something else we know and fear, because we meet it straight away in the first two chords of Siegfried, and that's the utterly evil power of the ring. The ring, you remember, has been twice stolen. Once as gold by the baddie Alberich, who rejected love to steal the Rhine maiden's treasure and forge the ring from the gold. But then it was stolen again, this time by Wotan, who craved its power and ignored Alberich's curse. The ring will belong to anyone, but it also infects everyone like a disease. So Wagner's theme for the ring shows this. It's really just one chord, but it's a mysterious, clouded chord. Full of tightly pressed, discordant elements, and it never belongs within a clear harmony. In fact, it destabilizes the surrounding harmony, and it's the chord that was always used in silent movies to express a destabilizing shock or horror, like when the heroine is suddenly thrown out into the snow. Musicians call the chord diminished, a name that hints at its thick, strained quality. And Wagner's instinctive use of it to denote the ring gives us a frame from the top to the bottom that spreads from here to here. Now lower these two distinct, dislocated sounds down into the bowels of the piano and put them into the orchestra's blackest colours, and you get the opening of Siegfried. But Wagner is rarely content with giving us just one hint at a time. And here, when you bring these two extreme notes back together again, you get that discordant semitone that burrows its way through the whole of the ring, like rust that never sleeps, eating into the musical fabric, spreading decay. This is the semitone we heard in the Rheingold, where it became the Rhine maiden's wail over the loss of their gold. You remember it had first appeared as a bright, whole tone in their opening hymn of joy. But it's quickly crushed into a semitone after Alberich's theft. Music forever uses the falling semitone as a cry of loss and sadness. Operatic tenors everywhere sing of Ahime or Hélas, or in German Weh, and in English Alas. All Wagner had to do was to reach out and use this twofold musical sound already built into our very earliest instinctive reactions. In fact, psychologists tell us that the falling semitone is automatic even when we're babies. If we're sad or in pain or need help, and we go, Mama. Which brings us back to the boy Siegfried in the forest, gazing at the sun through the trees and thinking of his mother. She's become a bit more real to him during the first act of this opera, thanks to scraps of information that he's gleaned. He knows now that Sieglinde gave birth to him, but died in doing so, while Mime, a blacksmith and the brother of Alberich, took him into his forge to bring him up. Mime is the kind of evil dwarf that you meet everywhere in fairy tales. He's always whining about never getting any thanks or gratitude. But frankly, what intrigued him most was the broken sword that Sieglinde had left beside the infant. Mime had heard about Wotan stealing Alberich's ring, and he knew that Fafnir, one of the giants, had turned himself into a dragon to keep guard over the ring, a special magic helmet called a Tarnhelm, and a whole pile of treasure. Mime desperately wants all this, and he thinks that as a blacksmith, if he can mend the sword, he can also train this young boy to use it to kill Fafnir, and so lead Mime to the gold. Ah, but the trouble with Mime's master plan is that he can't mend the sword. This is the cue for a visit from Wotan, down from Valhalla, and now dressed simply as a passerby, a wanderer. Here, Wagner gives a little dignity back to Wotan, and he supplies him with a stunning musical background. You might say a godlike cloak of unforgettable chords.
Heil dir, weise Schmied, dem Weg milden Gast, gönne Old des Hauses Herd.
Wotan explains that the only person who can mend the sword, kill the dragon, and get to the ring is the person who knows no fear. And that, we know, will be Siegfried. Mime knows it too, because try though he might, he's never been able to frighten Siegfried. Even that never bothered him. But after the departure of the wanderer, Siegfried comes back to the forge. Impatient at Mime's failure, the youth decides to do the job himself. But instead of trying to weld the broken pieces together, he files them all down to a pile of metal shavings, re-smelts them in a new mold, and then forges the red-hot steel into a new sword of his own, all the while inventing melodies that he gradually forges into a complete song. Listen to the hammer blows in the music. Here again, Wagner lets the music embody the story, because the second part of Siegfried's forging sword is a big, swinging, downward scale. But that is, of course, really his grandfather's spear theme. So at this moment, the boy is eagerly creating his own life, his own sword, and along the way his own theme out of his family's musical inheritance. During this scene, when Mime tells Siegfried that his father Siegmund's sword was called Nothung, or ready in need, Siegfried seizes upon the sword, swings away from his big downward scale, and leaps instead onto a big downward octave, which we remember as the octave his father Siegmund used when, swordless, he cried for help to his father Wotan, whom he knew as Welse. The sword embedded in a tree was Wotan's answer, and now that Siegfried is recreating it, the musical theme regains the splendour with which Siegmund, his father, first beheld it. Now Siegmund's son holds the renewed sword aloft, slices the anvil in two, and rushes out into life, with Mime desperately trying to keep up. So here he is again in the forest of Act 2, thinking over what he's learned about his mother, his father, and the sword. Oh yes, and the dragon, which he's now just killed. And thanks to the dragon's dying warning, he got wise to Mime's plan to kill him and take the gold. So now Mimi too lies dead, and Siegfried begins to wonder what world he has left to fit into. Up till now he's been a kind of nature boy, part of the woodland life around him, like a bird or an animal. But now he knows that he has a family background, however shadowy. He has a human life, and he needs to find his own world to live in. Just then, a forest friend, a woodbird, sings to him, and Siegfried hears it telling him where he may find a partner, thus sending him off to his first real human experience, finding and rescuing Brunhilde from her fiery prison to become his lifelong companion. In the few notes of the Woodbird's song, Wagner skillfully joins a picture of the sleeping Brunhilde with the unspoilt world of nature that we first heard from the Rhine Maidens 2.5 operas ago. You remember that at the opening of the Rheingold, the Rhine Maidens sang. At the end of the Valkyrie, the orchestra spun out its own version to bind Brunhilde up in her sleep, like this. And now in the middle of Siegfried, the Woodbird sings almost exactly the same music as his clarion call for Siegfried to go off and find Brunhilde. Who can ever find this companion? Asks Siegfried eagerly. Only he who is without fear, says the Woodbird. And Siegfried looks round at the fearsome dragon that he's just killed, and it clicks. Hey, that's me, he shouts. And he dashes off to the most exciting music to proclaim love, destiny, and the end of Act 2. And now, here comes something very strange indeed, because for 12 years, absolutely nothing happened. Wagner completely broke off the composition of the opera. The year was 1857. At first, he meant to have a rest for a few months, or a year, or maybe even 2. But in fact, he didn't come back to it until 1869, by which time 12 whole years had passed.
The most striking thing for me about Wagner is what kind of development he made as a composer from a young composer to Parsifal. This is unrivaled in history. If you listen to Mendelssohn, to Beethoven, to Brahms, to Schumann, to Mozart, they were geniuses at 14 or 11 or 6. Wagner, I think, was a very non-talented composer when he was young. I've just had the pleasure of conducting his symphony in C major, which he composed when he was 20 years old. It's a very bad piece of music. It shows so little talent, and it doesn't have any beauty. And then Parsifal is one of the biggest achievements of art in history. So where did he get this stuff from? How did he develop?
Many people have got all sorts of ideas. What's your theory? Why did he leave Siegfried at that time?
He'd been working on the Ring for about a decade at that point, almost a decade. And in all of that time, none of it had been performed. He'd written Rheingold, Die Walküre, the music, 2/3 of Siegfried. It seemed to be never ending. And he really, I think, must have felt the need to write something that was likely to be performed instead of trailing off into the distance. And he'd started to think about the story of Tristan and Isolde. He even thought at one point of writing it to be performed in Italian in Rio de Janeiro, because he'd received an invitation from the Emperor of Brazil. And I think that shows how keen he was to produce this work. Also, when you think of what was to come in The Ring, you know, the third act of Siegfried and all of Götterdämmerung, this was a really huge challenge.
Too big an ask.
Huge challenge. And I think he realised instinctively that he wasn't ready to tackle that.
Do you think at this break between Act 2 and Act 3 of Siegfried, something big, revolutionary had gone on
Yes.
in Wagner's musical imagination?
Yes. I have a whole theory about that.
Let us hear it.
The most interesting leap in time in this development is when he stopped to compose The Ring. He went on to compose Tristan and then came back to The Ring later. And in October of 1856, he met with Franz Liszt for 6 weeks. They were together in St. Gallen in Switzerland. For me, Liszt was the inspiration for Wagner. Liszt was actually the innovator, but Wagner had the genius to bring to a composition the ideas that he worked through with Franz Liszt. And then he decided to go, the new harmony idea of Tristan became clear to him, and he left The Ring to compose Tristan. And when he came back, it's wonderful to see that he went back to the motifs. He kept working in the same manner he worked before, but the whole sound is different.
Why did Wagner abandon The Ring and leave it on the shelf for so long? First, he couldn't seem to work up any interest from other people, especially from rich sponsors. And he himself had become so tied up in it all that he was now very tired and very broke. It was to be fully 5 years before King Ludwig tracked him down and offered him the sponsorship of sweet-sounding encouragement and sweeter-sounding money. Second, he was living here in Zurich, at the peak of his infatuation with Matilda Wesendonck, and desperate to write the opera Tristan and Isolde, which in real life would see Matilda as Isolde and Richard himself as Tristan. The story and the music for Tristan and Isolde consumed him for 2 years, but then the opera was finished, and the love story of Zurich had been told at last. A third and last reason for Wagner leaving Siegfried in limbo was, believe it or not, because of a philosopher. His name was Arthur Schopenhauer, and Wagner had first read his works in 1854. He was so seized by the man's ideas that he read everything through 3 times before coming up for air. Out of the many revelations in the philosopher's writings, Wagner was bowled over by his idea that of all the arts, music was the richest, the most direct, and the most transforming. Every other art, said Schopenhauer, needed some kind of add-on to help it make sense, a representation through words, through colours, through shapes, and so on. Music just flowed towards you directly, taking immediate possession of your imagination, making you feel its message without needing any sort of logical surrounding. Music was not the representation of an idea, he said, it was the idea itself. Of course, this all confirmed what Wagner had always thought, but up till now, he'd been concerned not to let music run away with its seductively sensuous sounds. That, he said, was for Rossini and Meyerbeer and all the other fashionable composers. Wagner had rigorously tied his musical sounds through themes to the dramatic course of the story. Now, Schopenhauer had given him back his confidence in music for its own sake. Simply because it spoke so touchingly and so directly, music could be allowed more independence to make its musical message by itself, while the dramatic explanation could be sidelined for a bit while music took over. That's one of the reasons why Tristan and Isolde has such a long prelude. Wagner was beginning to let the music be the story. In The Ring, he had already let himself do this just occasionally, like in the Valkyrie, with Siegmund's love song, or with Wotan's farewell, or even as now, with Siegfried in the forest, thinking about both the past and the future. So, while this new, more independent music was brewing in Wagner's mind, he kept his distance from the opera Siegfried until he felt he was completely ready. In Act 2, Forest Murmurs, that music that you're hearing is like a crossroads. After it, in Act 3, Siegfried is going to pass through adolescence to become a mature and more independent human being. At the same time, Wagner's music is also going to gain more independence. Thanks to the ideas of Schopenhauer, Wagner has become ready to free up his music's absolute obedience to the drama. Now he wants to relax his use of themes as mere signposts to characters and events, and instead to allow them to become more independent, more obviously musical. So like Siegfried in the story, Wagner too learns to put away childish things like giant themes and dwarf themes, like brown bear music, dragon music, magic spell music, and so on. Instead, he begins to allow himself to make passages of symphonic music that could stand by themselves and provide a new direction. The sort of new direction that Siegfried is about to rely on when he meets the sleeping Brunhilde. So, the first piece of music Wagner writes when he comes back to Siegfried after 12 years is the prelude to Act 3, a symphonic picture where about a dozen musical themes create a whirling musical kaleidoscope that conjures up the image of Wotan riding through the skies, Wotan's last ride, Wagner called it, to meet up with Erda, the goddess of the earth, to find out how it will all end. The music is full of what the symphony composers call development and recapitulation. Instead of just recalling a person or an action, the themes come together, freed from the need to explain the ideas of the drama. The themes become the ideas of the drama, and they're mixed together and layered through and thrown forward and back in time. It's a bit like flashback in the cinema, another medium that Wagner seemed to foretell. To make up this newly independent music, Wagner begins by taking the galloping theme from the Valkyrie. Underneath it, he lays down the theme for Erda. Then he grafts on top the theme for the need of the gods, which is going to be pivotal in Twilight of the Gods. Quickly yielding place to a desperate form of Wotan's spear theme. For the Rhine, which gets turned round to become the end of the gods. You also hear the semitone, the crushed Rheingold semitone. And because we're going to meet Brunhilde, we get a bit of her sleep motif as well. The whole thing is a complete musical summing up of the past, the present, and the future. Up till now, no one, not even Wagner, had written such a complex symphonic picture to begin the act of an opera. It's a new, liberated music, and Wagner uses it with enormous skill and exhilaration right through to the end of the Ring. And so Wotan arrives at the end of his last ride, but Erda gives him no joy whatever. Wotan has betrayed his position of trust. Now he can only stand aside and wait to see what Siegfried and Brunhilde will do to restore the world's treasure. Shocked at Wotan's betrayal of his calling, Erda sinks back into the earth. Merlin, we're lucky in this film because you've got such a versatile voice that you've sung 3 different voices. Wagner, did he have in mind definite tones and colours for each of these 3 women in the Ring?
Definitely, yes. He had a contralto in mind for Erda, which I'm certainly not. You know, I can sing the notes, but it's not the colour that he had envisaged. It needed a much chumpier kind of womanly, warm, earthy sound.
You said chumpier, which is a lovely word. You don't mean louder?
No, it's nothing to do with loudness. It's colour quality of tone. So it has a lot more, I mean, if we're going to talk technically, it has a lot more bass tones in the sound. Whereas if you're singing the Woodbird, for example, you have a lot more high overtones and it makes it a more silvery sound. So I can make my voice have the silveriness that is required for those higher, lighter ones. I can do the dramatic sound for a Brunhilde, but I don't have all that earthiness of an Erda.
Left to himself, Wotan makes a heroic decision to freely consign the world to the young Siegfried and Brunhilde with no further interference from him. And the music carries the story in its own overwhelming way. It tells us that Wotan's world of will and activity is now turned upside down and out of sight in a new theme called the world's inheritance theme. Here, the rule of law, represented by Wotan's downward spear theme, is upended in the theme that appears here. Now Siegfried arrives, led by the Woodbird, who's taking him to Brunhilde. He's totally unaware of who Wotan really is. But when the old man bars his way, Siegfried slices his spear in 2 with his sword Nothung. You can hear it in the music, where Wotan's spear theme is broken off halfway through. It's a especially thrilling moment since it's an exact inversion of what had happened to Siegfried's father in the Valkyrie, when Wotan's same spear broke that same sword Nothung. Now the orchestra exults in Siegfried's strength and bravery by playing another symphonic picture of Wagner's new style, and Siegfried passes through the flames into a world of wonder and revelation where he will meet his very first female human being. Act 3 is easy to tell. Siegfried meets Brunhilde and awakens her with a kiss. Passionately aroused, he makes ardent advances to her, but she keeps him at bay while she tries to overcome her jet lag between the world of the gods and the world she now finds herself in some 20 years later. There's a marvellously long exchange between the two, some of Wagner's most luminous music ever, including yet another new theme, usually called Love's Greeting, joyful and passionate at the same time. And there's a new piece of music too, soft and cooing, almost like a lullaby. It's set in Brunhilde's magic sleep key, and it binds together her first motherly love and care for Siegfried with her renewed womanly love now. Always, always, she sings, ewig, ewig. Wagner told his wife Cosima that the melody had come to him 5 years earlier when they first lived together briefly near Munich in 1864. Like Brunhilde to Siegfried, Cosima was always very much half wife, half mother to Wagner, and in gratitude he expanded this melody into a full serenade. It became famous as the Siegfried Idyll, and it's a piece that's forever associated with this place here, their home at the time, the Villa Triebschen in Lucerne. Wagner played it for the first time in 1870 on Cosima's birthday with a group of musicians draped over the stairs and down into the villa's entrance hall. By then, the couple had finally married and their one and only son had been born. Needless to say, they named him after the opera that Wagner had just completed. He was called Siegfried. It was probably the happiest time of Wagner's whole life.
During this Triebschener time, he get married with Cosima, and his children was born in this house, and he loved it very much.
You've made a study of many of the letters that he wrote here. How many did he write?
So he lived here 6 years. He wrote 1,500 letters.
It's astonishing, isn't
Yes,
it? And he
yes,
was
it is.
writing music and he was doing all this preparation.
It is.
He still found time to write all these letters.
He had also helpers, so it was Cosima, and there was also the young guy Hans Richter. He helped him to do this work. There came many important, famous people here. They came
Yeah, the
himself.
king came here.
Yeah, and Franz Liszt came here to visit Wagner, and also Friedrich Nietzsche. Yeah.
Had two children born there, Eva and Siegfried. He'd married Cosima. She'd finally made the break with Hans von Bülow. But there were all sorts of things calling him from afar. He had a very successful performance of Die Meistersinger in 1868, having originally left Munich under a terrific cloud of opposition and criticism in the media and from the king's courtiers, some of whom had known Wagner in his revolutionary days and didn't trust him at all. And I think he'd realised that if he was ever going to get the Ring performed, it would have to be somewhere else and he'd have to be there to organise it. And so when, in the early 1870s, he left Triebschen and returned to Bavaria, it must have been a hard thing to do for his family, because I think they had come to enjoy their life there. But I think from a personal point of view, yes, those years must have been very happy for him.
Meanwhile, back in the opera, Siegfried too is having the happiest time of his life. Using all his charm and mounting passion, he manages to build up Brunhilde's mood of warm maternal affection to one of ardent love. Only now does Brunhilde join hands with Siegfried, and they look forward together to a life till death do them part, laughing death as they call it in their newfound rapture. Exulting in the brave independence of their love, of their humanity, and indeed of their music, the new couple soar up to reach their highest note. The opera Siegfried, which began in such sinister blackness, now ends in the most radiant light.